You descend into New York like a confession. Fluorescent light, low ceilings, air that feels borrowed. Bodies funnel through narrow corridors. Eyes fixed forward as if any pause might turn you into an obstacle, another piece of clutter in the city's bloodstream. This is Penn Station as most people know it now, efficient in the way a basement can be efficient. Functional in the way a compromise can be functional. And that is the cruel trick of it. This is the same address where New York once built a cathedral, the same footprint where daylight used to fall on stone like a blessing, where arriving in Manhattan felt like being received, not processed. Old Penn Station opened in 1910, designed in a grand Beaux-Arts style, stood over these tracks like a public promise made in marble. If you want the wound in one sentence, it's this. People once entered the city like a god, and later were forced to creep in like a rat. The line endures because it names a shift in civic imagination the moment New York decided a masterpiece could be treated as a removable inconvenience, and that the future could be financed by erasing the very spaces that taught people what a great city feels like. The demolition was an ancient history. It happened in full view, under modern cameras and modern protests. Plans for a new Madison Square Garden above the station surfaced in the early 1960 seconds. And the tearing down began in late 1963. Trains still ran beneath while the great above-ground hall was dismantled, overhead beauty reduced to detours, marble reduced to rubble, dignity reduced to a memory you could only describe after it was gone. Imagine it simply. Morning, gray light, people wearing black armbands for a building, not because buildings breathe, but because the best of them hold a kind of shared life for everyone else. They are where a city agrees to treat strangers as citizens, where scale and beauty remind you that you belong to something larger than your errands. The replacement felt like a bargain written by accountants, an arena and offices above, and below them a compressed, windowless station that swallowed light and spit out hurry. The protests failed. The stone fell anyway. Yet the story doesn't end in defeat. It ends in consequence, because Penn Station, in dying, taught New York what it had been too complacent to defend. Outrage hardened into policy. Preservation gained teeth. A new civic instinct was born from the ache of too late. And this, then, is not only the story of a building. It is a martyrdom, a public sacrifice on the altar of development, and the first time modern New York truly learned that some losses do not feel like progress until years later, when you finally understand what you traded away. In the next part, we step back into the original dream, why the city built a Roman-scale gateway for ordinary travelers, and how that dream became vulnerable the moment greatness was forced to justify itself in quarterly numbers. Before the wound, there was the dream, and it was not modest. New York at the turn of the 20th century was a city intoxicated by momentum, bridges stitching boroughs into a single idea, towers rising like declarations, and the railroad acting as the great circulatory system of modern life. In that world, a station was never merely a shed where trains paused. A great station was a civic threshold, a public room large enough to teach millions of ordinary people that their arriving and departing deserved light, height, order, and ceremony. Penn Station was conceived in exactly that spirit, as a gateway to Manhattan that would not apologize for grandeur, because grandeur was the point. The Pennsylvania Railroad had a problem that was also an invitation to myth. Its long-distance trains terminated across the Hudson in New Jersey, leaving passengers to finish their journey by ferry, a transfer that felt small in minutes and enormous in symbolism. New York was the nation's loudest stage, and the railroad's entrance was a water crossing that made arrival feel like an afterthought. The solution demanded audacity. Tunnels under the Hudson, tunnels under the East River, rails pushed into the dense heart of Manhattan. But once you agree to bring people in beneath the city's streets, you inherit a second problem, psychological, not mechanical. You must convince the public that the underground is not exile. You must make the hidden feel honorable. And so the station above the tracks had to do more than function. It had to transform infrastructure into experience. It had to make progress feel noble. Old Penn rose as an argument in stone. It spoke in the Beaux-Arts dialect symmetry, discipline, proportion, and that peculiar confidence of a building that expects you to meet it at its level. Yet, style is too small a word for what Penn was doing. Penn was staging a lesson about civilization, that speed did not require ugliness, that industrial power could be clothed in grace, that a public building could be both efficient and magnificent without treating human beings like cargo. Picture the approach as it might have felt to an exhausted traveler. The facade did not shout. It commanded by calmness. Broad steps and massive columns offered a measured welcome, as if the city had learned manners. Crossing the threshold, you entered space that did something rare in a metropolis. It slowed you without delaying you. It changed your posture. It encouraged you to look up because the ceiling was not merely high, it was generous. And generosity is an architectural form of respect. The great waiting room and concourses were not designed only to contain crowds. They were designed to dignify them. Light mattered, proportion mattered, the arrangement of doors and corridors mattered. Because a building of this scale teaches you where you are and how to move without scolding you. Even the echo had a kind of order to it. The sound of many lives passing through a room that refused to become chaos. What made the dream profoundly American was not only its size, but its audience. In older worlds, grandeur often belonged to the few, and the many stood outside. Penn Station was a palace for anyone with a ticket, and even for those without one, who came simply to watch the nation move. Soldiers leaving and returning, immigrants clutching rope-tied suitcases, clerks and businessmen, families with children half asleep on their shoulders, lovers rehearsing casualness before they met under the clock. Penn did something subtle and radical. It offered dignity as a public default. It told strangers they belonged to the same civic story. It did not ask you to be important. It made you feel that the act of travel itself, this ordinary human transit between one life and another, deserved a room worthy of it. And in offering that dignity, Penn trained the public to expect beauty as a right, not a luxury. Not beauty in the shallow sense of decoration, but beauty as care evidence that a city had spent real thought and real resources to make shared life feel elevated. A station like that turns commuting into a ritual. You arrive, you pause, you orient yourself, you choose. You continue. You are not merely processed. You are received. Even for a few minutes, you are allowed to feel like a citizen rather than a number. This is why its later destruction would land like a betrayal, not just a loss. Because Penn was not simply stone and steel, it was an agreement made physical. It implied that certain public rooms that shaped the city's self-respect, would be protected from the hungers of short-term math. But history rarely breaks a promise by shouting. It breaks it by changing the weather around it until the promise begins to sound naive, even at its peak. Penn existed inside forces that did not care about marble. Railroads were businesses before they were myths. And businesses are vulnerable to changing habits. As automobiles multiplied, highways expanded, and air travel grew glamorous. The railroad's dominance weakened, revenues thinned, costs became louder, and what had once looked like destiny began to look like burden. Grandeur, in a fearful economy, is easily recast as indulgence. A masterpiece, under financial pressure, can be reduced to a balance sheet inconvenience. Old Penn was built to endure in stone, but it lived inside an economy that could change faster than stone could defend itself. The very magnificence that made it a cathedral also made it expensive to maintain. And once a building is framed as costly, the language begins to rot, beauty becomes excess, space becomes inefficiency, light becomes wasted volume. Public dignity becomes a line item that cannot prove its worth on a quarterly report. So the context is not only that Penn Station was glorious, the context is that it was glorious at a moment when America still believed public grandeur was part of progress, and then it lived long enough to watch the cultural definition of progress tighten into something meaner. A new faith took hold, that value could be measured almost entirely by revenue per square foot. That the city's future should be financed by extracting every possible dollar from its most central land, and that the public would eventually accept any replacement as long as the trains kept running. When the storm finally arrived, it arrived in a familiar disguise, not as hatred, but as practicality, not as vandalism, but as redevelopment, not as loss, but as making better use of space. That is how a masterpiece becomes vulnerable, not when people stop admiring it, but when admiration is forced to compete with profit, and profit is allowed to call itself inevitable. In the next part, the struggle begins, the slow conversion of a cathedral into a problem, and the calm, business-like reasoning that persuaded a great city to dismantle its own crown in broad daylight. The tragedy of Penn Station did not begin with a wrecking ball. It began with a sentence that sounded responsible. It began when powerful people started speaking about the building the way one speaks about a worn-out machine, as an asset that no longer justified its cost, as a piece of real estate failing to perform, as an outdated shell sitting on land too valuable to be wasted on mere arrival and departure. This is how civic beauty is usually killed, not by rage, but by a spreadsheet wearing the mask of common sense. By the mid-20th century, the Pennsylvania Railroad was no longer the unquestioned monarch of American travel. The country's romance had shifted to highways and cars, to the seductive idea of personal freedom on four wheels. Air travel was rising as the glamorous frontier. Meanwhile, rail passenger numbers weakened, and the company's expenses, especially the maintenance of a vast, aging station of stone, glass, and steel, began to look like a punishment for past ambition. The building that had once been a triumph of modernity was relabeled, quietly and efficiently, as a burden of upkeep. And once that label sticks, everything that follows can be described as necessary. There was another, more sinister factor. Penn Station was not just a building. It was a massive block of Manhattan's most strategic land. To a railroad executive under pressure, the station was less a cathedral than an opportunity sitting in plain sight. Above the tracks, there existed a kind of invisible gold, air rights. The permission to build upward over the existing rail infrastructure. The idea itself sounded almost magical. Sell the sky. Keep the trains in an era increasingly trained to monetize every dimension of a city. That magic became policy. Why let a waiting room occupy precious space when you could stack revenue on top of it? Why preserve grand voids of marble and light when you could convert them into rentable square footage? This is where the struggle took its cruel shape. It was never an honest debate between beauty and ugliness. It was framed as a debate between nostalgia and survival, between sentiment and solvency, between a building and jobs, a stadium, a modern facility. The station's defenders were made to sound romantic, soft, impractical people who loved columns more than commuters. The station's destroyers were granted the language of adulthood. They spoke of progress. They spoke of modernization. They spoke of inevitability. And yet, what they proposed was not merely a new station. It was a fundamental reversal of priorities. The new plan centered Madison Square Garden and an office complex above the site, treating the transportation function, the true reason Penn existed, as something that could be compressed and pushed underground like an embarrassing necessity. The station would no longer be the city's front door. It would be the building's basement. Travelers would be moved beneath an arena, beneath commerce, beneath entertainment, arriving in Manhattan not in a public room of light, but in a low-ceilinged system of corridors designed for throughput, not dignity. Opposition rose because people could feel in their bones what was being traded away. Architects, artists, journalists, historians, and ordinary New Yorkers protested with a vocabulary that sounded almost desperate because they were trying to defend a value modern language had trouble pricing. They argued that the station was not just beautiful, but culturally necessary, that it made the city better simply by existing, that it taught citizens and visitors what public grandeur could be. They warned that once such a building could be destroyed, no great place would be safe, because every masterpiece could be reduced to underutilized space. But outrage without legal teeth often becomes theater. There was, at that moment, no strong framework in New York City that could protect a building simply because it was historically or artistically significant. Preservation as a civic mechanism was still weak, still informal, still dependent on persuasion rather than power. The defenders of Penn could plead shame and publish, yet they could not stop the machinery once permits, contracts, and political will aligned behind demolition. What makes this struggle especially brutal is how public it was. This was not a nighttime theft. It was a slow daylight dismantling, performed in the open, with the city watching itself commit the act. In 1963, as demolition began, passengers still needed the station, trains still ran beneath. Commuters were rerouted through temporary passages, while above them the great spaces were taken apart piece by piece. The building was not simply removed, it was disassembled like a corpse being processed, while the living continued their routines underneath. That overlap, daily life, continuing beneath the destruction of daily dignity, gave the entire event a particular modern horror, the normalization of loss. The imagery of that period lingers because it revealed how powerless beauty can be when it lacks an institution to defend it. Marble blocks cracked and fell. Ornamental stone was smashed into debris. The great rooms built to make people feel taller inside themselves were carved down until there was nothing left to stand in. Photographs from the demolition read like war documentation. Except the enemy is internal and the violence is bureaucratic. There is no invading army. There are only permits, contracts, and the unstoppable momentum of development. Meanwhile, the justification stayed clean. The rhetoric remained calm. That calmness was part of the crime, because if the destroyers had seemed vicious, the public might have rallied more fiercely, but they seemed rational. They spoke in numbers. They spoke in timetables. They spoke as if they were simply rearranging furniture, not amputating a civic limb. And as long as the trains continued to run, as long as daily life remained possible, it became easier for many to accept the loss as background noise. Modern cities are trained to endure trauma as long as it doesn't interrupt the commute. Yet beneath that acceptance, something sharper was forming, a realization that the city had no rules strong enough to protect itself from its own appetite. Penn Station became the symbol of that vulnerability. It became the proof that New York, so proud, so iconic, so sure of its identity, could still be persuaded to trade its finest spaces for the promise of revenue, and call the trade progress. In the struggle, then, was not only a fight over one station, it was a fight over the city's definition of value. Is a public masterpiece useful only if it generates profit? Is a civic room justified only by commerce? Or does a city owe its people more than efficiency, more than a place to move through, but a place that dignifies the movement? The tragedy is that these questions were asked loudly, passionately, even prophetically, and still the demolition continued. Penn's defenders were not wrong. They were simply early, speaking a truth the law had not yet learned how to enforce. And so the station died while the city argued about whether it deserved to live. In the next part, we reached the climax, the moment the destruction became irreversible, the moment the loss finally registered as historical, when New Yorkers realized they had not merely replaced a station, but erased a standard, and that the city's future would now carry a scar that could not be renovated away. There is a particular kind of violence that does not look like violence until the last moment. It wears a hard hat. It carries permits. It arrives with schedules and polite announcements. It makes sure the trains keep moving so the city can pretend nothing essential is happening. And then one day, you look up or you look back and you realize the thing you assumed was permanent has been reduced to absence. That is the climax of Penn Station. Not a single explosion. Not one cinematic collapse. But a long, methodical dismantling that turned a civic cathedral into a cautionary tale until the caution finally became undeniable. By the time demolition began in earnest, the debate had already been decided where decisions truly matter: in contracts, in political permissions, in financial agreements that made reversal too expensive to imagine. What the public saw was a fight. What the machinery of power had already achieved was momentum, and momentum in a city trained to chase the next project can feel like fate. The first and most brutal moment was psychological. The instant New Yorkers understood that the station's beauty did not grant it immunity. People had complained before about ugly buildings. People had mourned the quiet disappearance of older neighborhoods. But Penn was different. Penn was not a small treasure tucked away on a side street. It was monumental, central, symbolic. So obviously a masterpiece that many assumed it would be protected by the sheer force of common sense. Its vulnerability proved something chilling. Common sense is not a legal category. As the work progressed, the station became a theater of disbelief. Crowds gathered to watch the dismantling, not as tourists, but as mourners. Some came with cameras as if documentation might act as a kind of rescue. If we record it, perhaps we can save it. Others came simply to bear witness. Because witnessing is what people do when they are losing something they cannot stop. The image of black armbands, people dressing as if for a funeral, was not melodrama. It was accurate. A city was bearing part of itself while insisting in official language that it was upgrading. And the demolition itself carried a grotesque symbolism. Penn Station had been built to lift you into light. Its destruction pushed you downward into a maze. Great public rooms became temporary passageways. Marble and ornament were turned into debris and trucking routes. The city continued to operate underneath, which created an almost surreal split reality. Above, the death of grandeur. Below, the relentless continuation of necessity. If tragedy is often defined by the coexistence of the unbearable and the ordinary, Penn was tragic in the purest sense. You could buy a ticket and catch a train while the ceiling of the old world was being removed overhead. Then came the moment that turned protest into prophecy, when it became obvious that the replacement would not be an equal exchange, but a downgrade of the soul. The new arrangement treated transportation as something shameful, something to be buried, while the arena and commercial development claimed the air and the identity of the place. The station was no longer a civic living room. It became a service corridor. It became a mouth in the ground. This is where the language of progress began to crack in public perception. Not because people suddenly hated stadiums, or because commerce was new to New York, but because the hierarchy felt wrong in a way anyone could sense without architectural education. A city can forgive ugliness when it is poor. It struggles to forgive ugliness when it is powerful. And New York was powerful. The destruction of Penn made the city look not modern, but careless, like a wealthy heir pawning family heirlooms for quick cash. If the climax has a date in the mind, it's the late 1963, beginning of the demolition, the moment the irreversible act moved from paper into physical reality. Once the tearing down started, hope shifted from stop it to at least save something. Save the facade, save the statuary, save the great room, save the memory in fragments. But fragments are what you collect when the war is already lost. They are what you hold in your hands when you need proof that the thing you loved was real. And even as the building disappeared, something else, something quieter but consequential, was being assembled in the public mind, a new sense of shame. Shame is not always destructive. Sometimes it is the beginning of ethics. The Penn Station disaster created the kind of civic embarrassment that can no longer be shrugged off. It was not simply a building came down. It was we did this, and we cannot unsee what we have done. We infamka, we know we cannot. That shift is the true climax. The moment a city realizes it has crossed a line it did not know existed. In the immediate aftermath, the loss was experienced as grief, an emotional response, a cultural mourning, but soon grief hardened into a political demand, never again. Not never again in the vague sense of nostalgia, but in the practical sense of law. Because here is the bitter irony that gives the story its martyr shape. Penn Station's death succeeded where its defenders' arguments had failed. The demolition became the evidence preservationists needed. It showed that persuasion alone was insufficient. It demonstrated that a city without protective legislation is a city that can be stripped of its masterpieces, one profitable deal at a time. Outrage finally became institutional. New York moved toward building a framework that could designate landmarks, restrict demolitions, and force the city to treat certain places as more than disposable property. In other words, the station did not survive, but it changed the rules of survival for everything that came after. That is what makes its destruction feel like martyrdom, the sacrifice that teaches the community what it should have known before. And still, the most haunting part of this climax is personal, not political. It's the experience of arriving in New York after the demolition was complete, stepping into the new underground station, and feeling without being told that something has been taken. You feel it in the ceiling pressing down. You feel it in the absence of daylight. You feel it in the way the space urges you to hurry, to move, to not linger, to not look up because there is nothing to see. A cathedral invites you to pause. A basement invites you to escape. So the climax of Penn is not a single crash, but a transformation. From public grandeur to private profit, from a city that believed in monumental welcome to a city that learned to treat welcome as unproductive. And once that transformation occurred, New York could not return to innocence. It had to live with the knowledge that it was capable of this kind of self-erasure. In the next and final part, we step into the resonance, the aftershock that still shapes the city today. We'll trace how Penn's martyrdom gave birth to preservation law, how that law changed what New York could protect, and why the station's absence continues to haunt every modern argument about redevelopment, identity, and the price of forgetting. After Penn Station died, New York did what human beings often do after an irreversible loss. It tried to construct meaning strong enough to justify the pain. Grief, left alone, becomes bitterness. But grief translated into action can become a kind of delayed wisdom, a moral intelligence that arrives late, but arrives with force. The destruction of the old station did not simply leave an empty space in the skyline. It left a new question in the city's bloodstream. If we can erase something this beautiful, what can't we erase? And once a city asks that question honestly, it can no longer pretend that its future is automatically better than its past. The immediate aftermath was a strange mixture of numbness and outrage. The train still ran. The crowds still poured in and out. The city's practical life continued as it always does, because cities are machines of survival. Yet a different, quieter life had been wounded, the life of civic pride. For years, New York had carried an unspoken assumption that it was too important, too cultured, too self-aware to commit a purely senseless act against its own heritage. Penn shattered that assumption. It proved that even the most iconic city in America could behave like a man selling heirlooms to pay for a new suit. That embarrassment mattered. New York is a city that feeds on confidence. It sells itself to itself. It survives partly through its self-mythology, the belief that it is the capital of taste, ambition, modernity. Penn Station's demolition punctured that mythology in a way that no editorial alone could, because the evidence was physical, the absence was undeniable. And when absence becomes public and permanent, it changes the tone of every argument that follows. Suddenly, preservation was not a niche hobby for romantics. It was a defensive necessity for a city that had proven it could be reckless. From that necessity emerged something rare in civic life: the translation of aesthetic grief into legal power. New York moved to create rules that could protect landmarks, real rules, not polite requests. The city's landmarks law and the institutional force behind it were shaped by a growing recognition that market logic, left unchecked, would eventually consume every building that could be replaced by something more profitable. This was not an abstract fear anymore. Penn had already demonstrated the mechanism: take an irreplaceable public work, reframe it as inefficient, monetize what sits above it, and bury the human experience underneath. Without law, that method could be repeated indefinitely. So the preservation movement gained its strongest argument, not from theory, but from trauma. Penn became a case study that required no explanation. Even people who had never loved architecture could understand the difference between arriving in a civic temple and arriving in a basement. They could feel the downgrade, as instinctively as one feels the difference between being welcomed and being processed. And that shared recognition created political pressure, a demand that the city treat certain buildings as part of the public trust rather than disposable property. The residents did not stop at policy. It entered culture. Penn Station's death became a symbol, a shorthand, a warning told to each new generation of planners, developers, and officials. In every later debate, every proposal to demolish something historic, every argument that it's old or it's not profitable, every insistence that progress requires replacement, Penn hovered like a ghost in the meeting room. It became the story people invoked when they needed to remind others that the city's identity is not only in its skyline, but in the rooms beneath it, the places where daily life is elevated or diminished. And the irony is that this ghost grew more powerful with time. At the moment of demolition, some still believed the city would simply move on, that the pain would fade, that a new generation would forget the old station ever existed. But cities, like families, carry certain losses as inherited memory. The more photographs and stories circulated, the great columns, the high glass, the monumental calm, the more Penn became a kind of moral reference point, a proof of what New York once had the courage to build and what it once lacked the courage to protect. This is why the phrase "the day New York died" continues to resonate. It does not mean the city stopped functioning. It means something subtler. A portion of New York's innocence died. The belief that greatness is self-sustaining died. The assumption that beauty will be protected simply because it is beautiful died. Penn taught the city that, without guardianship, even masterpieces are vulnerable to the most ordinary human temptations: greed, impatience, and the desire to call any profitable action inevitable. Yet the story's resonance is not purely mournful. It contains a kind of hard-earned redemption. Penn's sacrifice helped save other places. Its absence helped sharpen the city's capacity to say no. And in the years that followed, New York's preservation framework would be tested, sometimes fiercely, against the ambitions of money and the impatience of modernization. The city learned it slowly that protecting heritage is not anti-progress. It is progress with memory. It is development that refuses to cannibalize identity. Still, even redemption has its limits. No law can resurrect a demolished cathedral. No commission can rebuild authenticity once it has been crushed into landfill. The best preservation can offer is prevention, an attempt to ensure that the next Penn does not die the same way. And that is why the story continues to sting, because the lesson arrived only after the cost had been paid in full. Today, when you stand in the current Penn Station and feel the low ceiling and the artificial light, You are not merely in an inconvenient transit hub. You are inside a living reminder of what happens when a city treats its greatest public spaces as negotiable. The place functions. Yes. The trains run. Yes. But the experience tells a different truth. That efficiency without dignity becomes a form of quiet cruelty. And that commerce, when placed above the human spirit, compresses life into corridors. Penn's martyrdom leaves us with a final question that is both practical and philosophical. What is a city for? Is it a machine to extract revenue from land? Or a civilization to shape the lives moving through it? The answer is never spoken once. It is built and rebuilt in every decision about space. And Penn gone, and therefore unforgettable, insists on one last haunting insight. The price of destruction is not only what you lose today, it is what you teach the future to accept as normal. If Part 5 was the aftershock law, policy, the civic vow of never again, then this final part is the lingering bruise. The way Penn Station's martyrdom still shapes New York's body language today, even when people do not know its history. Because the most enduring consequences of a cultural crime are rarely found only in archives or legislation. They are found in habits, in expectations, in what a city quietly trains its citizens to tolerate. Walk through the present-day Penn Station and you can feel the lesson embedded in the architecture like a scar under skin. The space does not invite you to arrive. It instructs you to move. It is not a room, it is a system. Its ceilings press down with the psychology of don't linger. Its corridors funnel you the way machinery funnels raw material. Even the noise has a different quality than it does in a great hall. In a cathedral-like station, sound rises and disperses. In a compressed one, it ricochets, accumulating in distress. You cannot prove this on a spreadsheet, but your nervous system understands it immediately. The building tells you, without words, that you are not a guest of the city. You are traffic. And that is the first debt New York continues to pay. The cost of diminished experience. When a city trades away dignified public space, it does not merely lose beauty. It loses the emotional infrastructure that makes daily life feel human. 1,000 small indignities, tight passages, confusing signage, the perpetual sense of being herded become normalized. People adapt. Because people always adapt. But adaptation is not the same as thriving. It is simply survival with lowered expectations. The second debt is more strategic. Penn's demolition proved to every developer in America that even the most beloved buildings can be negotiable if the financial narrative is strong enough. That precedent is a dangerous kind of education. It teaches the market that outrage fades, that cities can be pressured, that memory can be outlasted. Yes. Preservation law arose partly in response, but law is not a wall of granite. It is a living structure that must be defended, amended, enforced, and believed in. Every generation has to choose whether the spirit of Penn's lesson remains active or becomes ritual words repeated without vigilance. And there is a third debt, perhaps the most intimate, the loss of a shared standard. Old Penn taught people what the best could feel like. It demonstrated that public life could be elevated, that civic spaces could make you stand a little straighter. When such a standard is removed, it becomes harder to demand it again, because the memory becomes abstract. Younger generations grow up assuming that transit is meant to be claustrophobic, that public interiors are supposed to be ugly, that discomfort is simply the price of a city. They do not miss the cathedral because they have never stood in it. They inherit the basement as baseline reality. This is why Penn Station's martyrdom remains so potent in the imagination. It is not only a story of loss, it is a story of what loss does to ambition. A city that has been burned becomes cautious in some ways and reckless in others. It becomes cautious about trusting permanence. It becomes reckless about accepting compromise. Over time, compromise hardens into culture. At least it works. People say, at least the trains run, and every time that phrase is used to excuse degradation, Penn's ghost grows a little stronger, not as sentiment, but as warning. Yet the story's final resonance is not only bleak, because Penn's death also created a vocabulary. It gave preservationist and civic-minded citizens a myth with teeth, a shared reference that can be summoned whenever the city is tempted to repeat the pattern. When people argue about what should be protected about the soul of a neighborhood, the meaning of a facade, the value of a public room, Penn is the evidence that the price of demolition is often revealed only afterward, when it is too late to negotiate. It also clarified something that modern cities often try to deny, that beauty is not decoration. It is policy. It shapes behavior. It affects mood. It influences how people treat one another. When a city builds spaces that feel dignified, it cultivates dignity. When it builds spaces that feel brutal and rushed, it cultivates brutality and rush. Architecture is not neutral. It is an instructor. So, what is the epilogue of Penn Station? It is the recognition that martyrdom is not only a death, it is a transfer of responsibility. Old Penn died, and in dying, it handed the city a burden to prove it learned something, to prove it can still build public spaces that honor the human being, not just the transaction, to prove that progress can be more than profitable replacement, that it can include memory, continuity, and respect for the invisible life that happens between destinations. And perhaps that is the final, unsettling truth. Penn Station was not destroyed because New York hated beauty. It was destroyed because New York, in a particular moment of modern history, believed it could afford to treat beauty as optional. That belief is the real villain. It is a temptation that returns in every era, wearing new language, efficiency, density, modernization, optimization. When you hear those words in future debates, you should remember Penn. Not to freeze a city in time, not to turn preservation into superstition, but to keep one moral fact alive. Some structures are more than property. They are public, memory-made, walkable. They are civic self-respect made physical. And once you demolish that kind of building, you do not simply remove stone. You remove a part of what people believe they deserve. So the day Penn Station died was not the day New York stopped. It was the day New York learned that its greatness was not guaranteed, and that the most expensive mistake a city can make is to confuse what is profitable with what is priceless. And so we return to Penn Station, not the one of marble and daylight, but the one we hurry through as if hurry were the natural shape of arrival. We call it normal. We call it just a station. But a city's real biography isn't written only in skylines. It's written in the rooms where it decides whether people deserve dignity or merely direction. Vincent Scully saw the truth before most of us were ready to admit it. One entered the city like a god. One scuttles in now like a rat. Penn's death did not happen in silence. It happened in daylight. With witnesses. With protests. With photographs, yet it still happened. Because the calm language of progress can be sharper than any wrecking ball when a city stops defending its own soul. And here is the cruel mercy of martyrdom. It teaches the living what the dead can no longer recover. From Penn's rubble, New York learned to protect what it once treated as negotiable. But the lesson arrived with a price no law can refund, because you cannot landmark an absence. So the next time you step into that underground maze, don't just look for your platform. Listen for what the ceiling is telling you. A cathedral asks you to lift your eyes. A basement asks you to lower them. A city that forgets its past doesn't simply lose beauty. It loses its standard. And when the standard falls, we start mistaking survival for greatness. Fade out on something small but sacred. The old angel. The broken ornament. The last photograph where daylight still poured through stone. Let the music thin to a whisper. Let the screen go dark slowly so the audience has time to feel what New York learned too late. Some places are not meant to be replaced. They are meant to be remembered and defended.